A work of art doesn't have to be explained. If you do not have any feeling about this, I cannot explain it to you. If this doesn't touch you, I have failed. That's by Louise Bourgeois, and we're going to talk about that and many other quotes from her today. Look, we're just trying to get away from, as we've done a little chalk talk, looking back at season one, realize that virtually every episode start off with one or both of us saying, "Man, I sure am excited to talk about this today." Yeah. So we're just trying to break that mold a little bit. And this was the quote that kind of inspired this episode and kind of what we're going to get into today, Ty. So before we get into other quotes and discussing this, why don't you give us a quick bio on our artist of focus for the day?
Yeah, I absolutely will love to do that because Louise Bourgeois is one of my absolute favorite artists in the history of art. I've seen a lot of her work around the world, and I feel like every time I see a work of art of hers, it's something new that I didn't even know she did or created. And she's French-born, but a French-American artist. She moved to the U.S. in the 30s. I think it was the mid-30s with her husband. Had a tumultuous childhood in France that was really, really hard on her, especially after her father had an injury in the war, and learned how to sew and do things because her father had a tapestry factory. So she learned some skills and artistry at that point. And then when she moved to the US, she moved at a perfect time in the world to be around art. Was when the AbX movement was starting and the abstract artists in New York. And so we've talked about a lot of her friends from Pollock to Rothko to de Kooning to all the 9th Street women were all kind of around her, but she just didn't really fit in that group of painters, right? Because most of those were painters. The overall percentage of that movement were painters, and she painted and she did things, and there happened to be conversations around that at times where those guys would say, "You're not a painter." How that affected her, I don't know. There's not much about how that affected her psyche, but she had a professor that told her, "You need to be a sculptor because you think three-dimensional." And so that really kind of encouraged her to really start taking these ideas and taking them to the third dimensional of form. And so she made and made and made and made work, but, had little shows and had things, but nothing truly happened to her until she was 70 years old. And she ended up having a show at MoMA in New York that was a retrospective of her work. And literally overnight, Louise Bourgeois became a household name in the art world, and it all follows. Tate, Whitney, Venice Biennale. I mean, you name it, galleries, museums, public spaces. We'll get into some of her public works. Most of you have probably seen her spiders in her public works, but she really invested herself into her work as a form of healing and therapy. Somebody who dealt with trauma, someone who dealt with sexism, who dealt with all these subjects that really made her feel trapped and fearful. And she took all of this and put it into her work as a way of expressing freedom from those things and healing from those things. So this is a great one for you and I to talk about. I think a great artist. We have things in common with how we make our art and how she deals with her art. So I'm really excited to dive into these themes that tend to be really deep.
Yeah, this was, I had an alternative opening for this episode, and that was going to be to make 80s, 90s sitcom reference on a very special episode of Boy Meets World. Yeah, we've decided that we're gonna open up a vein and get real with some of these quotes that we're going to discuss today. I was, of course, familiar with her work, but was not aware of the abundance of fantastic, phenomenal thinker she was about art and about life. And this could have been, or heck, who knows, could be a 3+ hour episode just based on that. Having rewatched the documentary, which I highly recommend everybody go and watch. It's available for free on YouTube. Do you recall the title?
The Spider, the Mistress, and the Tangerine, something like that. I believe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So if you get a chance, spend some time watching that. It's just the power of her personality is just so captivating. I don't know how tall she was. She looked like
she was not very tall.
Maybe 5 feet, right?
She might have been 5 feet, but maybe 30 feet in stature and character.
I was just going to say that. Yeah. I mean, her energy and her conviction of with which she spoke, I can only imagine owned every room she ever occupied, and it's powerful. So
I wouldn't want to cross her in the wrong way. Let's just say that.
That's exactly right. And just to this is our whatever disclaimer that we sometimes forget to share, but we're not art historians, and that's not the focus of our podcast. There's a lot of tremendous information about her work, her life. Our focus today is really going to be on how she thought about her life and her work, which are so inevitably intertwined as they tend to be. And so that's what we're into, is just really dissecting great thinkers around art, and just kind of dissecting quotes by them. So we kind of got this episode laid out in 3 acts. And in the first act, we're going to talk about just kind of why this whole idea matters. And the first quote of hers that I want to introduce, or second, I guess, after our initial one, but is very simple, but extremely profound. Art is a way of recognizing oneself. Art's a way of recognizing oneself. And as I was reflecting on this one, the reason I kind of wanted to kick the conversation off with this one was because I was thinking about, my experience, which is quite a bit different than yours, in that I came to art in middle age. I had already kind of gone through some of the things that happened when we, get to that phase of life. Was at least the age of a full-grown adult when I started making art, consistently. And so the reason I share that is because art really introduced me to myself in a way that nothing else could. Like, when you talk about...
Can you say that one more time? Just that little snippet that you said.
Yeah, art introduced me to myself in a way that nothing else could. And I've always been somebody who's very focused on... I've always been a learner, a reader, very, growth-minded, done plenty of, personal work, blah, blah, blah. But there were aspects of my personality that I didn't even know existed, and certainly couldn't access until I got into the practice of making art consistently. I'm somebody, as I've learned, who is very, I feel things very deeply, but and I'm working on this, but oftentimes there's a disconnect between what I'm feeling and my ability to process those emotions. I'll talk more about that, in a little bit. So once I started making art, once I started spending time with myself in the studio, the mirror that became my process and the work that resulted from it changed the way that I think about life and the way that I think about the core of my being, at the risk of, hyperbole. But art really introduced me to myself in a way that nothing else could. And I guess I'll throw that back to you. What was your experience, or tell me your thoughts on this quote and just what art has done for you on a personal level? How's that for a broad question?
Yeah, we've talked about that a few times. Just the fact that when you're working on your work, you're really working on yourself. You're looking at yourself. Like, everything that's coming out is you, as parts of you, pieces of you, memories of you, things you've accumulated, hurt, joy, all the emotions just kind of get wrapped into that moment of solitude where you're emptying or filling, or however you're creating, it's coming out in that story. And I remember from, I started creating at a very early age because art was in my family. I had an uncle in the art world. I had a grandfather that loved art and loved poetry. And so I was around it. And I think the first time I really remember recognizing myself through my art was probably, I had a horrible temper as a kid. And I used to get really mad at my folks, and I get really mad at my mom. And I remember one time my mom saying, "Go in your room and draw your anger." And so I went in my room, and my mom, I believe she still has this. So if I can find it somewhere, it's a sketch of me drawing like this monster with curly hair, and it says "Mom." But when you think about that, right, that's really like emptying that emotion onto paper. And that's how I felt. Like, I literally was that angry that I felt that way. So I think that was my earliest beginning, but I didn't understand what that meant until probably after college. Took a while to really understand. And I think that's wisdom, that's knowledge, that's growing older, that's experience, all those things that you accumulate over time. And as an artist, if you're always working, you're thinking a lot. And I think it took those moments of deep introspect and thinking to kind of figure that out.
Yeah, Yeah, I mean, these are the types of, I want to say conclusions as though it's definitive as that, but these are the types of conversations we have with ourselves that ought to be ongoing, assuming that we're interested in continuing on a path of self-discovery and transformation. The next quote I want to throw in the mix, there's so many. I mean, we probably won't get to all of them that we've got on the docket here, but it relates to the previous. My art is a form of restoration in terms of my feelings to myself and others. My art is a form of restoration in terms of my feelings to myself and to others. So you brought up a lot of the tumultuous experiences and traumatic experiences that she had in her life. I believe it was said that, I can't remember who said this in the doc, just because that's fresh in my mind from rewatching it, but something to the effect of all of her art really being about exploring, her childhood. She said something to that effect, as well. So again, kind of going back to my experience with, there are a lot of feelings I had towards myself and towards others and towards, specific experiences that, had you asked me before I started on this path of being an artist, I would have said, yeah, I've worked through that. I have restored my feelings around myself and others in that regard. And it wasn't until I got into my art that I realized, there's way more here. There's way more here than I thought,
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it wasn't until I got to spend time with what I was making in my hands, and when it's going well for me, I assume for you as well. When it's going well for me, it goes from my heart to my hands, and we're skipping the head as much as possible, at least for the bulk of the process. And I realized as what I was processing was reflected back to me, that there were a lot of feelings that I had towards myself and towards others that needed restoring, to the quote that I hadn't fully processed. I was in a mode where, I was in business, and I was in a mode where if an emotion wasn't, if I didn't deem it useful or productive, right? Great way of, processing one's emotions. Is this productive? Oh, it's not. Let's push it down and set it aside.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't aware that I was doing that, but that is absolutely how I was operating. So is this emotion useful? Yes or no? If no, off you go. There's no need to even acknowledge its existence, beyond dismissing it. And so for me to now be in a place where, my art helps me to restore my feelings and even just become aware of what they are, it's amazing. Yeah, I'm living in a different world than I was, previously.
Well, I think that's the reflection that I have seen studying, watching, reading about Louise Bourgeois. Is I have seen the fact that if she did not have the opportunity to create the way she did, the restoration would have taken either a lot longer process or never existed. Yes. And so I look at her personality as a person of absolute strength and resolve, but with a temper that could harm, right, when you think of others, if there wasn't restoration involved. And I know there's plenty of stories of her getting into it with curators and other artists and her assistants and people. So I'm sure, she had a physical presence and direction where she wanted things to go. But if she wasn't able to have that restoration, how would her life have looked, right? Because there's moments where she talks, where she disappears emotionally into the moment when she was 8 with her father or older, and you watch her disappear into pure emotion, whether that's like a sadness and you really feel it, or if it's an anger or a rage even at times. And then you look at her work and the process and how it comes out, every little bit of that is completely worked out into pieces, from seams to sewing to just the way she holds and moves the sculptures and things. It's completely, constantly working itself out in an act of restoration, I feel like.
Well, maybe that's one of the benefits of not really being discovered, or not discovered, but, publicly known until you're 70. She had really had time, to process and work through a lot of those different concepts and ideas to be able to tell a much more complete story, right?
We talked about that. Yeah. There's a few of us that kind of talked about that conversation. Like, what do you do for those 40, 50 years? And she taught in university. She taught at Pratt. She was involved in the art world. It's not like she was a hermit and completely absent, right? And just hiding and making work. She was active and trying, but as far as the recognition, right, and really being seen, she had the body of work to fulfill what happened when she exploded.
Right. Yeah.
She could say yes to everything. I think if every museum in the world came to her, she would have a body of work that could go in her room.
Yeah.
That's astounding. That is a feat in itself.
The story of curators coming in, because she kept a lot of work at her home.
In Brooklyn.
The one story of the curator coming to her, getting a peek in the basement, and her being like, "Nope." But it's just
that's
seeing
enough.
An entire.
You've seen enough.
Exactly. Yeah, seen an entire basement full of decades worth of really developed work. It's pretty crazy. I'm going to throw in. We're going to call an audible here and weave together a different quote that ties to the previous, I think, really well. She said, "Art is restoration. The idea is to repair the damages that are inflicted in life, to make something that is fragmented, which is what fear and anxiety do to a person, into something whole." I'm going to read that again, but hopefully better. Art is restoration. The idea is to repair the damages that are inflicted in life, to make something that is fragmented, which is what fear and anxiety do to a person, into something whole.
That quote rocked me. When I came across that quote, I love the word restoration. It's one of my favorite words. It's just a magical word, because it's something we all, whether we're artists or not, are kind of fighting for in life. And I think thinking through repairing those damages that are inflicted to you, right, breaks you apart. It kind of takes you into pieces. And that's what fear and anxiety do. They just completely pull at you from every angle and create little bits and pieces that tear you apart. But thinking of art and the restorative process of taking all of that and creating something whole out of it. Yeah. And that's what she did so well, is these are my fears. These are the things, her cells. I've been in a few of her cells in different countries around the world. And that's what she did. The cells are her fear and anxiety all encapsulated into one little thing that she can go in and out of constantly. It's freeing her from that fear. She's putting the fear and anxiety into that cell, out of her and into that cell. And that process is restoring. I can't imagine what it might have felt like for her after one was finished to walk out of it and then look, right? You can physically look at that and kind of give that deep breath, And I think I did a series of, 2017, maybe 2016, called Fragments. And I was really kind of dealing with that existential or philosophical idea of, are we born whole and become fragmented, or are we born fragmented and we become whole? Yeah. And so I was thinking of my life and my trauma and my experiences and thinking, okay, are you whole when you're born and then all those things break you apart? Right. And then you have to restore. Right. Or are you born broken apart and then you're restoring as you go? And I don't think there's an answer for that, but it was my process of coming to grips with healing and trauma and things over time, and trying to find those pieces, and through my art create a restorative process for myself as well. Yeah. There was a period of time where I wanted to name everything that I made Humpty Dumpty. Or name a show around it. So just that whole idea, of with Humpty Dumpty, taking all these fragments that had broken apart and trying to put them back together in a way that is as good, and, as we'll maybe talk about a little bit later, better than it was before is pretty interesting. And to your point too about, her life, she spent all of her life, which was a long one, processing and putting things back together that had happened, in her case, 80, 90 years previous, which to me is like, that's a wild thing to think about. How deep some of those wounds, must have been to still be present enough to, I want to say access, I don't know if that's the right word, but to still, mine the depths of for decades. And there was something that she said that really, or not that she said, that somebody else said, and it was in a different something I read on her. And they talked about how with her creation, that each of the cells, and I'm speaking of the cells that I just talked about, her installations, they deal with fear as she felt she was a prisoner to her emotions. So for her, it was a form of catharsis to confront this childhood trauma and transform that fear and take that fear and anxiety and create strength and solace from it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That act in itself, taking fear and anxiety that make us feel so small and so alone, and creating something of strength and solace, formidable, that commands a room. Like, just when I sat thinking of just the comparison of those two things, like, there's a deep, beautiful psychological something happening there, where she's taking something that makes you feel so weak and so impersonable and so small, and then transforming it into this massive thing of strength and solace that just sits on its own, that is bigger than anybody else's in the room, that just makes you weep when you see it because you just feel it. I mean, it's just magic to me. It's magic.
I mean, it goes back to the quote that we opened with, right? A work of art doesn't have to be explained. If you don't have any feelings about this, I cannot explain it to you. If this doesn't touch you, I have failed.
Yeah.
And if you've experienced her work in person, you've probably been touched. You know, I've not had the opportunity to experience any of her cells in person, just photographs. So yeah, it sounds like it definitely succeeded, with you and with your experience.
Yeah. And here's the power of art over time, is that I think it was I'm trying to think of what year Mandy and I were in Milan in Italy visiting her family. We were going to the Wes Anderson cafe that's in Milan, and we found it, but didn't know it was attached to the Prada Foundation, their museum there in Milan. It's the cafe for the museum, but we didn't know. We just went to see Wes's thing, and then we popped in, and I was going up the Gold Tower. If you look up the Prada Foundation in Milan, it's an incredible looking museum, and there's a tower that's pure gold that goes up maybe 5 flights of stairs. And at the time, each room at the top, each flight of stairs, each room was a Louise Bourgeois installation or piece. And I had never seen any of her knit work before. The big figures that are knit and just kind of curled up and holding each other. And they were so powerful, but I had no idea what they were, what they stood for, but they moved me. And then years later, when I fall in love with Louise Bourgeois and start studying her and really looking in, it's completely transformed that emotion and power even deeper for me. So you look back years ago, I saw it and it moved me. And now that I'm really digging into her, it's 10 times the emotion and the feeling I have knowing what goes into those stories.
I wonder how much the diversity of, material and medium influenced her ability to mine some of those same experiences for so much time. You think about the, from rolled steel, towers that go 2-3 stories high down to these delicate, knit fiber, like the range is tremendous,
When she was a vivid dreamer, right? Mm-hmm. So you think of somebody who's a vivid dreamer, you have to have every single thing at your disposal to try and create that feeling, that memory, that dream, that vision, and I love how she says, when you're capturing a memory, you have to be true to the memory because the memory changes. And the memory is going to be different for the other part of the memory, the other person of the memory.
Right.
And she just talks about the depth that she goes into trying to really think about that memory, because you have to nail it. You can't fib. You can't, you know what I mean? You can't make it up. So you think of that depth, you have to be multidisciplinary with that depth.
Yeah.
Right? You can't just go, I'm going to paint. And that's what she tried in the beginning. And, I think she would have got there eventually, but having that other person say, you need to do this. This is where you're going, and to embrace it. But you can't capture those things with just one thing, can you?
I doubt it. I can't imagine how. I mean, it's funny. You got me thinking about memory and how unreliable our memory really is. I mean, I was reading a random article about how, eyewitness testimony used to be the way, but going back, pretty far, right, to get a conviction, to where now it's a lot less depended on, in the courts, because it is so unreliable.
Yeah.
I think most of us have probably had the experience of, whether it's with a sibling or a parent, trying to like piece together different parts of a story, right?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, that one trip we took, and then we stayed at the hotel. No, we camped that trip. No, I'm
Yep.
sure of it. We stayed at the hotel that had the pool that wasn't working, and then we stopped at that diner. No, it's just, but you're kind of piecing things together, and sometimes the truth just is dependent on whoever's most convincing or certain of what everybody of that shared experience. It really is interesting. Let's move on to Act 2.
And I think what we just talked about really moves into your quote for Act 2 as well.
So now we're the idea with setting this up was why this matters, and how this idea really captivated the two of us. For this second part of today's conversation, I really want to talk about what happened, and kind of open the vein for both of us personally. I'm going to lead into that with a quote from Louise, and then share kind of how this idea sort of came about for us to discuss this today. But she said, "Tell your own story and you will be interesting." Tell your own story and you will be interesting. And I think that, for me, one of the things that I have learned from sharing my story in recovery is the power of radical vulnerability. It is not something that came naturally to me until, my life in escaping the clutches of addiction depended on it.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized, there's no way for me to get better, for me to get through this without just opening it all up and saying, here's everything. Realizing that, especially in that dynamic, that keeping things from other people, and most of all from myself, was only going to keep me sick and keep me in that behavior. So one of the things that I have learned, every year, I just, this is a April, as we're sitting here recording this, we're right between two of the most impactful anniversaries that I have in my life that really inform my work, and things that I'm still processing and working through on a personal level. On the 16th, every April 16th is my sobriety anniversary. So in 2002 of April 16th of 2002 is the last time that I took a drink or a drug. And that was a big part of what informs, my work, and really I'm going to call it a fascination, obsession, a calling, whatever, to really try and tell a visual, material story of transformation.
Yeah.
And, so for me, again, like, not to, I always go back to, I can't remember where I heard this, but when I did, it unlocked a lot of things for me. The worst thing you've been through is the worst thing you've been through. And so I share that because I think I needed to hear that, because I, again, back where I was living and how I was thinking when I was setting aside there's so many people that have had it worse, which is definitely true. Sure. I want to make that real clear. Like, this is not like a trauma competition to see who's been through the worst stuff, or asking for for sympathy. But these are real things that happen, and I think that from that radical vulnerability, one of the things that I learned, again, through I'll just say it, from working in the 12 steps, to completely transform my life into something that a life that I didn't even want to be alive anymore. I've shared this a little bit before. I'll give the brief history now, but I meth was my end of the road drug. I was absolutely, it's the type of drug that steals your soul. There's a couple of end of the line drugs, meth and heroin are pretty high on that list of, once you get to that point, there's nowhere else to go, really, from there, other than jail or death, or, hopefully freedom, from that addiction. And so starting from that place of, I am nothing, I don't want to exist, it's a really interesting starting point to really kind of dig in and examine, how did I get here and what happened. And I think that, that's something that absolutely informs my work, and it will inform, the rest of my life, much
Yeah.
in the same way that some of the things that Louise went through informed hers. She said, I'll throw the next quote in here, "I have been to hell and back, and let me tell you, it was wonderful." How's that for a quote? I think that, for both of us, I'll stop rambling here and see if you have any follow-up questions for me before I ask you to get vulnerable as well. But I think that it's a trip you never choose to take. Nobody books a ticket for hell.
No.
Intentionally, but we've all been to our version of it at time or times, in our life for different reasons. And I think that one of the benefits of processing emotions and piecing Humpty Dumpty back together again, taking those broken fragments and creating something that can be whole again, is so tremendously valuable. You could look back and say, I'm better because of, not in spite of, but because of what I went through, if that makes sense.
No, it totally makes sense. And I have a quote to go into that. It's something that I heard her say, and she said, "Art is the experience, the real experience of trauma."
Yeah.
And I hadn't heard that one before until I was watching an interview with her and she said that. And I thought, art is the experience, the real experience of trauma. And I went, okay, I got to unpack that for a second here, because if art is the experience, why is it the real experience of trauma? And I thought, well, trauma isn't just negative. Like the experience of trauma is healing as well, and overcoming as well, and restoration as well, right? So it's not just the negative sides of trauma. The experience of trauma holds everything in the same bucket. And when an artist is creating their work, if they're sharing their story, it's going to come out no matter what. If you're making art, pieces of you, your story, who you are, they come out somehow. And other artists put more of their story into their work than others, or more of that emotion in. So I think for her, when she's saying that, she's giving the rage, but she's also giving the solace. She's giving the moments of healing. She's giving the moments of anger. And it's, and she's combining in some of her work. All of those things are encapsulated for the viewer to experience when they view it.
And it's really hard to have the perspective of, oh, this is going to help me, be better than I was before. I mean, that's the whole point of healing, again, is not just to get back to baseline, but to get better than, we even were previously. This came up recently. I get a chance to speak sometimes, and I was talking to a group at an alternative high school, and you don't end up at this particular school on a winning streak. You're not going there because regular school is going super well for you, and some of the things that some of these kids, the principal was telling me, have been through are unimaginable, and horrific. And I tried, and I'm pretty certain that I failed to even introduce them to the idea of the fact, or my belief, I suppose it would be a better way of saying it, that they have more opportunity to offer more to the world because of what they've been through. And I went back to I was walking out in the parking lot, and it was just like, when you're speaking, when you connect with people, and when you don't. And I've had, plenty of both experiences, and this was the latter. I was just like, and I realized, like, they're still in it, right? They're just trying to survive right now, And so I shared that because I think that there is a lot to be said for the distance, the perspective that comes from having some distance between the trauma and the healing. Of course, we want to start the healing process as soon as possible from whatever, the thing is. But thinking about Louise's story, the benefit of having decades to look back and think and process. I'm now myself more than 2 decades removed from that experience, and I'm still unpacking things like, for example, for the longest time, my whole narrative was, I had great parents, great upbringing. Like, I just really was curious and got caught doing something and then I just couldn't stop.
Yeah.
And as time has gone on, again, not to turn this into a therapy session, but as time's gone on, I've realized like, oh no, there's way more to it than that. That led me to use in a way that is not normal or healthy. And so, yeah, I'm not sure what was your experience like, or I guess how has some of the things that you've been through, how has that informed your growth trajectory?
Yeah, I mean, it's informed my growth trajectory immensely. And for years, I never talked about my trauma for years. And I think that's a very heavy male dynamic as well involved in that we want to handle it ourselves. I mean, I'd been through counseling. I'd been through, numerous things over the years because of what my trauma did to me in destructive patterns. And I think that, well, I know what changed it. I read a book, and I'm gonna read the quote, even though it's not Louise Bourgeois, just because it's what made me say, what am I doing? I need to be a voice for men who have experienced what I've experienced, number one, and to say, listen, you need to talk about your shit. You need to talk about your past. You need to be vulnerable with it. This needs to be talked about. And so it hit my art right after I read this quote. And it says, stories are able to help us become more whole, to be named. And naming is one of the impulses behind all of art. To give a name to the cosmos we see despite all the chaos. In art, either as creators or participators, we are helped to remember some of the glorious things we have forgotten and some of the terrible things we are asked to endure. And that's by Madeline L'Engle. And when I read that quote, I went, number one, stories help us become more whole. Can I help somebody else become more whole through my art by being vulnerable with my story? The answer to myself was yes. Not saying this is the answer for everybody, because I think as an artist, you only give what you feel like giving. If you don't want to give everything, don't give everything. And I don't think you should give everything. I think you should give up to a point and then let the audience then decide. But when I read, either as creators or participators in that art, we're helped to remember glorious things we have forgotten or terrible things we were asked to endure. Mm-hmm. And that word asked to endure pretty much means you didn't have a choice in a way to endure it. And so I think that just really, really like hit me. And she follows up, Madeline, saying, I love, therefore I'm vulnerable, a few more sentences in. And when I do have a love for people and I want to see healing, I went through as a young boy, I was raped. And so I went through destructive patterns that were absolutely horrific from that point on. And I think art is the thing, like Louise, that helped me externally put that rage out without that rage destroying me. That was the point when things changed. And I think I read that quote and I did a series, post fragments, called Cosmos, or it was called These Are My Shapes, a conversation with someone. And the whole idea was a dream I had where I was telling my story to a room of people at a gallery. I was up on stage and I'm telling my story, and it's sectioned into 10-year periods. At the time I started it, I think I was 41 maybe when I started the piece. And so every 10 years I built into the story. And in this dream, I'm telling everybody wisdom and knowledge I've gained and sharing these deep, deep truths, but nobody's paying attention. They're all on their phones. They're literally like, taking pictures of selfies of each other, and they're looking out the window. And so I end up having this conversation with myself in the dream. Even though I'm talking to a crowd, I'm really having it with myself. And when I was working on this series, I came to 4 pieces that were in that period of life of destruction, when all of my trauma had caught up to me. Which we all know when we've experienced trauma, there's a point where it catches up, right? Where you hit bottom, right? Mm-hmm. Which you would say in recovery, where somebody hits bottom. And I had hit bottom at this period of time in life, and I was very destructive. So those pieces, I wasn't even trying to go that hard. It just came out. I mean, I was telling the story and it was coming out interesting. And I felt like I went back to hell in that moment. I don't agree with Louise. It wasn't wonderful. Hell and back, right? For me, it wasn't wonderful, but the process of putting it into my art was wonderful. And then I hated those pieces. I feel like I overworked them and all this stuff. And my mentor, Mako Fujimura, came to my studio in Waco, Texas, to visit when he was speaking at the university, Baylor University. And he came to my studio and he wanted to see work. And I said, hey, can I pull a couple pieces out for you to look at? And I pulled those 4 out. So I was working on them at that time. And I said, I hate these. And he said, that's the first time anybody's ever brought out work they don't like to show me when I visit. And I thought, I just need you. He said, turn them around. Let me see the back. So I turned all 4 around. I think they're 7 feet by 4 feet. Turned them all around, put them against the wall. And he goes, wow, I can feel that. No wonder you have worked these. I don't know what these are about, but I can feel it. This is heavy. And he went, oh, and I was like, from the back of the painting. And there was, stains and marks, and I'd sewn all these things. And so then I shared what they're about. And that's when he told me, it's up to you what you give. If you put these out there, you don't have to title them. You don't have to give any notion as to what they're about. You don't have to talk about those things. And he said, it's akin to a boxing match. You go to watch a boxing match, you can see the fight. You can feel it from outside, but you're never going to be in the ring and know exactly what it feels like. So sometimes we need to treat our art like it's the boxing match in the ring, and the viewers on the outside can only get close enough, but they can't get all the way in. I also at that point said, you know what? I'm going all the way in for a purpose. And so since then, I've spoken about my trauma, and I've been really open and vulnerable with it, like you have as well. And so I think that's a mutual thing. I think that's why we both have, a deep respect and admiration for each other and each other's work too, because we can feel it and sense that and see it.
I wonder about that boxer metaphor. When you said it, I loved it, and then I immediately want to amend it. but what I want to the way that I hear that is that what I want to change about it, or what I'm as I interpret it in my own broken brain, is it's going to bring people in or bring people back to whatever their own fight was/is. Right. In other words, I'll put this to you in a question. Like, when you experienced the cells in person, do you feel like you were experiencing her specific trauma, or were you feeling the weight of something so visceral that it connected you to your own?
Yeah, I wasn't feeling hers at all.
Right.
Because number one, I didn't know the story. I didn't, like I do now, right?
Yeah.
I don't know the story. I don't know her. I didn't know anything about that the clothing was actually her mother's clothing that she had kept all those years, that was sewn into, those things. But there was just something about going in to the cell and being in there and feeling almost as if you were walking into the trap, walking back into something heavy.
Yeah.
And then walking out and feeling free again. Right. So there's definitely the emotion of going into something and coming out of it in a deep way. I'm not like just an in and out. It was like an in and just disappearing into something that you knew was heavy, that you knew was difficult.
Yeah.
And then coming out of it and feeling like the burden was now removed.
And that goes to our opening quote, right? Of like, if you do not have any feelings about this, I cannot explain it to you. If this doesn't touch you, I have failed. So it's any feelings about this, not the prescribed feelings about this, right?
Yeah.
And it's just about being touched, by the work. That's so powerful, And I think hold on, I want to amend that. We don't know what she meant precisely, but that quote of being to hell and back, and it being wonderful. When I read that, I don't think she would. That was great. I loved every minute of it. the way I read that and my interpretation of what I think she was getting at is what it made the doors that it opened for me, were
what it
wonderful.
gave her as her ammunition for creating. Yes. And
That's right.
for me, I absolutely agree with that, because I would be a different artist if I had not experienced some of the things I've experienced. I would be a different artist.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, would she want a different life? I think so.
Sure.
Louise, right? And
Yeah.
I think that's evident in moments when she's talking about her father.
Yeah.
Who changed drastically after the war, who treated her horribly, who treated her mother horribly. And I feel like when she talks about her dad, you can see the angst in not having the father she wanted.
Mm-hmm.
And she continued to try to allow him to exist over time before he died. And I think, and then after he died, she went into a really deep, dark depression after that. And I think it's because she was yearning for the father she wished she had that she never got from him.
Yeah.
And I talked with a few female artists in the room. We watched it all together. I was lucky. I got to watch with 3 female sculptor and installation artists, multidisciplinary artists. It's like, oh, this is amazing. And they said, yep, I know that feeling.
Yeah. And shout out to, it was Allison that brought this to the conversation the other day, right?
Yes, it was Allison.
Yeah. So we had a little delay there. So I messaged Allison. I said, Ty and I are going to have to talk about this. And it was right along that time when my, anniversary came up, and I was like, oh, this is something that we need to talk about. It's not like this is like it's never fun. I never look forward to like telling my story and like,
right.
oh, isn't this, but it's,
but what it's done for others
right.
who have struggled or been through similar things, who may not have the makeup to be a voice for themselves or for others. And we 100% have the ability to be a voice for others.
Yes.
I absolutely believe in that so wholeheartedly, that you have the ability to be a voice for somebody else who isn't confident enough to be that voice. And you build confidence in them by being bold.
And we're talking about I'm saying this on your behalf. Ty's talking about the collective we, like all of us, like you who's listening to us right absolutely. Now, have the power with your specific story to impact people in ways that no one else could because of what you specifically have been through.
And here's the even more beautiful thing, the power that your art can have in that moment when you choose to be bold with your work.
Yeah.
Whatever that may be, your story, your trauma, your healing, politically. I mean, in so many ways, art has had the power to impact, influence, and bring experience to things that need to be talked about, need to be shared, or we need to be vulnerable with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The next quote.
Can I add something art-wise real quick before we get to the next quote?
Absolutely not. This is a one-person show, and you're working for me, pal. Yeah, of course.
So,
please.
The series I was sharing about, where I had each piece, each body work every 10 years, the titles read like a manuscript. So all the titles from the very first one to the last, if you put them all on a page, it would read like you were reading a script, right? It'd be like lines being read, and it flows together from piece 1 to piece 16. I remember how many I made. Well, I had a show in Austin, and I had a few pieces in the exhibition. And when we talk about the first quote about failing if somebody doesn't get anything from it, I came in the next morning early after opening night, and it was during the Austin studio tour. And I had 2 female artists who came up to me and said, "Hey, can we talk to you for a second?" And I said, "Sure." And they said, "I don't know if this is right, but we're both theater students at UT, University of Texas, Austin. And we were reading your titles, and they felt like a script, a monologue, but almost a dialogue. So we stayed late last night and went back and forth reading together, and we were in tears."
Wow.
And in that moment, I stopped. It was the first moment I've had that deep of an experience with 2 artists when I wasn't in the room, who experienced the work that way without me talking about it. And so we sat and talked about it for a while, but that was what Louise is saying. And it's so powerful when that happens.
Yes. Yeah, that's a great segue into kind of our third and final act here of today's conversation, which is just talking about how the fragments, how the pain, how whatever we've been through shows up in the work, and how the work communicates it without us, even being there. It's funny. You made me think about another, an experience that I had, which was at that point for sure the most meaningful moment I'd had around people experiencing my work in person, especially people that were just there for the show, that didn't already know me and weren't already going to say, "Oh, hey, it's really neat what you're doing." You know what I mean? And so this was my first solo show. During the opening, there's a feature piece, and if you're not watching on YouTube, if you're just listening to us right now, just know that we also put this on YouTube.
Yep.
And if you want to see, pictures of what we're talking about, that's where you'd find those. But anyway, this is also a cue to the editor of this podcast that we can throw some photos of the piece I'm about to describe in there as well. But the feature
I'll remind
piece,
you to send me that picture.
Yeah, I will. So the feature piece of this show was a large scale diptych. It was about 6 feet by 8.5 feet altogether, and it was the opening. I was talking to a couple, a pair of friends, and they approached me, and the first one said, "Hey, we just wanted to tell you that the two of us had completely different experiences.
Love it.
With your work." And she goes, I'll go first. This for me was a really, really heavy and dark and emotional piece for me. I can't stop looking at it, but I'm looking forward to when I'm not looking. It was dark. And I said, "Yeah. And how about you?" And the other woman said, "I had the exact opposite experience. To me, this is extremely hopeful and uplifting and full of light and optimism for the future." And I said, "I don't care if anything sells. I don't care if everybody leaves right now and says this, like you both just absolutely made my night and made this show for me, because you're both right. You're both spot on. Like it's all in there, Yeah. And for me, I think this is maybe where our processes differ a little bit. I don't know what the work is about until the work tells me what it's about. I don't go into like, oh, this is going to be about, but as I've become a bit more experienced at, and I guess just aware of the fact that I am, processing feelings that again, like I mentioned earlier, I don't otherwise have a straight path to, or a door, to really dig into. It's all going to come out, and that will be what kind of tells, what the story is. I mentioned having two sort of meaningful anniversaries in April.
Yeah.
The other one is April 29th, and on April 29th of 2010 is when my sister was killed. She was 28 years old, and she was shot and killed by a man that she was involved with. And I talk about this a lot less than I talk about my recovery. My recovery has there's a very purposeful dialogue around, people that are still struggling. And much like your story earlier, one thing I learned is it's not hard for me to talk about, but it's hard for people to hear.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Sure.
I mean, it took me a minute to recover from, even though you had shared that with me previously.
Yeah.
But still, that's a lot. It's a lot.
Yeah.
It's a lot, And so I think that I just bring that up because that's one of the biggest things where, like, I just didn't have. There's probably a better way of saying this, but the way it comes to mind is I just didn't have the emotional, like, toolkit to really process the grief that I was experiencing, at that time.
All grief is different. It's not the same. And that's, you learn that when you go through healing or recovery and things, that grief operates in different ways.
Yeah.
Based on different traumas and things. And so, it's a very different.
And that piece in particular was one of the few where I was like, I'm at least going to spend time with the music. I've got a playlist that was Amy's favorites that I don't listen to it often, but when I do, like, it's a lot, and that definitely came out in that piece in particular. And I don't know that Yeah, and that's kind of the thing. It's like, back to like the and this came up in the part one, I think, or part two, I forget, of the Puchko conversation with all of the artists and residents
Yeah.
that are there with you, of just, again, our opening quote, which has kind of been the glue that's hopefully tying this whole conversation together. But just the fact that a work of art doesn't have to be explained.
Yeah.
And when someone comes up, and as an artist, you've been asked this question, if you've shown it to anybody, a version of, oh, what's this about? Or what were you going for here? Or what was the, I think it was Francis that spoke to this very eloquently in that episode. So if you've not listened to that, go back and check that out. But to the story that I just shared, it's like, does it move you? Do you have feelings about it? Does it touch you in any way? If so, then that's what it's about. And
I think as artists, Nathan, we're also editors. And so we need to pick and choose how we edit.
Right.
And that's not just the work, that's also the conversation.
Yeah.
Around our art. And and I think that's what Mako was really getting at with me in my studio that day, is he was really telling me to be a really intelligent editor.
Yeah.
Maybe there's a crowd where that work shows and you actually talk about the work and the depth. And then maybe there's a crowd where that work sits alone and nothing's ever mentioned and it's not even titled. Yeah. And so I think as artists, we also need to be very intelligent editors with how we present our work, how we speak about our work. And we're all different. We all want to say more or say less. Everybody operates differently with their work and how they are going to present that to the world and talk about it and share about it. Some people want to say nothing, right? Look at Clifford Still and how he labeled his paintings. He didn't make emotional labels or deep stories. I'm a writer. I'm also an artist. Sometimes my titles are 3 or 4 sentences long. Sometimes they're one word. But I think that's what you're kind of saying, is there's a moment, right, where you kind of realized in your head, you know what? It's time to edit this conversation and keep it to, why don't you just let me know what you think? Does it move you?
Right. Because the last thing I want to do is take a person's experience from, oh, this is both heavy and hopeful, to, oh, that's a piece about his sister being murdered.
And you have the power as the artist to do that to the individual viewer.
Right.
You have the ability to change their perception of the painting by what you say.
Yeah.
And so that's where, as an artist, being the editor is, how do you want to operate as an artist? Do you want to be somebody that does alter that conversation? Or do you want to be the person that, like Louise, creates it and says, well, I hope you feel something. If you don't, well, I failed. I'm going to go make 30 more.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's a tough one. That's a really difficult one, because we are 100% going to be put in situations where we're with the audience and they want more and they want to know more and they want to know more and they dig in. Yeah. And it's how we respond to that really in the end is our decision. But you usually don't get there unless you learn. Yeah. Unless you've had it happen to you, where depending on the power of the piece, it can affect the rest of your night. It can affect the rest of your week, And so I think it's really intelligent to know how you're going to handle situations as an artist when your work is up on a wall and in a room.
Yeah.
Where do you want to place your vulnerability? Do you want to place it in you? Do you want to place it in your title? Or do you want to just let the work speak for itself?
Yeah. And that's a question that will continue to present itself. And we get to choose how we answer it on a day by day, piece by piece, show by show, basis. A couple more quotes I wanted to explore. Yeah. And I think really what I was going for with this last little part here is just talking about just kind of how we have, or what we've done with what we've experienced, and sort of how it shows up, in the work, to kind of contradict what I was just saying, before. But it's interesting. This is something I'm very comfortable talking about on a holistic scale, and something I'm very reluctant to talk about on an individual scale, right? On a piece by piece basis, right? Like I love talking about how, whatever my experiences, my perspective, thoughts, whatever ideas influence my process and the work that comes from it. And so, I guess I'll do that a little bit, because it's something that, again, the work reflected back to me, informed me what it was about. I never set out to make work that was going to tell the story of transformation, that I've been through. That was never my mission. But I do remember the day where, and you or someone looking at my work and now knowing my story would have been like, really, dude, you didn't connect these two dots? Like, and the answer is no, I didn't. It took me a long time to realize that's what I'm doing. So I guess I'm just reinforcing the point of me being emotionally and intellectually stunted, in those ways. But when I realized it really came about when I started working with trash and when I started working with things that had been discarded, and I was journaling as I know you and I both do quite a bit of, and I wrote out, from discarded to discovery. And I was like, oh, that's it. That's like my work fundamentally is about transformation. It's about taking something that is or was broken, that's been set aside, that's been dismissed as being trash. People rightfully, wrote me off, and a lot of people have been written off, as hopeless case, nothing to be done with this one. And again, largely because of my experience, in the recovery community, I've seen so many amazing stories that just bring me to tears of people who have gone from, I'm just going to share this story. This morning, I was talking to somebody at the gym, another friend who's in recovery, and he was telling someone else's story. I'm not going to use any names because I don't actually even know this individual's name, but he's like, I actually work with good friends with a guy. He runs every day, 10 miles a day with a 40-pound weight vest, but he runs on the route. He used to be homeless. He was homeless since he was 10 years old, has not had a place to receive mail until he's in his, mid 20s. And now he's gotten off the streets and he's gotten sober, but he runs where he used to, live. And now he brings food and money and water, and he hands things to, that's freaking powerful, man. Yeah. Like that's transformation.
Yeah.
That's what it's all about. And I think that, thinking about somebody who, was, ignored, right? Look to now being somebody who's respectful, who's an example of, what's possible with discipline, with growth, et cetera. It's unbelievable. It's so, it's so amazing. And so I didn't realize like, oh, I'm taking this garbage, I'm taking this trash, and I'm processing the fact that whatever other people thought about me, setting that aside, but that's what I thought about myself. I had written myself off. I had decided that I wasn't worth, living in a way that honored or respected my health or, my existence, as a whole. So to take that, and I don't know, we talk about mining the depths of experiences, who knows, but I can't imagine getting to the end range, of that. I think that's a theme that's going to be explored with, everything that I'm doing going forward is giving that material, giving that garbage a voice, giving it a new story to tell, different than, oh, I'm nothing, I'm not important, I am to be dismissed and shoved aside the way that I once treated my emotions and still do when I'm not in a good place.
Yeah. And just to reiterate this to everybody listening, we didn't set out in this episode to go, we're going to talk about trauma and healing and, and all in our stories and things. It was the fact that we both just got absolutely floored by Louise Bourgeois and her voice and her quotes and her work. And it tied into Nathan and I and our story so well that it was a great marriage of an artist to talk to. And I think, there's so many corollaries between all the things that she has said and everything that we're talking about, and you talking about, using the discarded and bringing it to the table. And, I think that's why with all of my sculpting, I use found objects for pretty much anything that I sculpt when I'm working 3-dimensional. They're all found objects. And I think it's that mindset of, there was a time where I felt like I was just tossed aside at the hands of somebody else. And so being able to put that in, create something out of it, and having seen my journey going from something that was so broken and so just in shambles to actually growing up out of that into the something. And a lot of my work, which in a conversation with our friend Moxa from Spain here this last week, he was like, all your work seems to go up. Your compositions are all going up. And even in sculptures, they're things sprouting or blooming and going up. And I had never thought of that before. It hasn't even crossed my mind. So like you said, like we're working and we're making things, and then these themes and these meanings can present themselves either in our own thinking, but there's sometimes where the audience is even feeding you things that you hadn't even thought about that may have been happening in your subconscious. And so I think that putting discarded pieces together and growing into something that became something out of it is powerful for me. And I think that also goes into your next quote that you have here.
All right, so I had to dig a little bit here while you were talking, because there's a quote that I came across as I was preparing for our conversation that I did include. I mean, just go Google, quote, and you'll be blown away by how many. And there's more than a couple that deserve a place on your studio wall. But this one, to what you just said, Ty, really struck me as well. She said, horizontality. Is that how you say that? Horizontality.
Horizontality. Sure.
Let's go with that.
Let's do it. Let's roll with it.
Horizontality is the desire to give up, to sleep. Verticality is an attempt to escape. Hanging and floating are states of ambivalence.
Whoa. Oh. Damn.
And I did become aware of this fairly recently.
That got my emotions going. Like, I thought it might. Serious right there. Ooh.
I thought it might.
Wow.
Because this is something that I'll let you process that. I'll share in this unloosed something for me as well. But I did become aware of this fairly recently, that almost all of my work has an element of reaching, of stretching. There's almost always a vertical component to it. In fact, this is an older piece. This is one that has a little bit of both. But to me, it is a reaching out. My faith, my spiritual practice is a big part of my life and a big part of my work. Yeah. And for me, that verticality it's an attempt to escape, but it's also an attempt to connect, with the source, with a much deeper well of peace of mind and serenity than I am capable of generating on my own by a magnitude of infinity, I just wanted, I thought about including that. And then when you said that just now, I had to. So now that you've had a moment to collect how does that hit you?
I mean, it's funny because, I'm pretty numb to talking about my trauma, these days after you talk about it, and it doesn't hit you like the first few times you talk about it, but there are times that things just, that quote really struck me. Interesting that I'm so emotional right now, but I think there are moments in the past, researching Louise where I've just been really moved deeply.
Yeah.
By her work, by her voice. When I hear her voice, I get really emotionally moved by her. She's she's an individual that I wish I would have had the ability to sit with her. Would she have given me the time? I don't,
right.
I don't know. Right. She was talking about somebody that's focused on making their work.
Yeah.
I don't know. It really, really hit me. And I think too, being at the end of a residency with, former students or mentees in my program that I've grown really close to personally, and having just the wisdom and the voice of somebody like Moxa speaking to your work and the things that he's seen and that they're seeing and that they're being moved, and you didn't expect them to be moved the way they've been moved by seeing your work in person, and vice versa, me not expecting to be as moved as I have seen their work. And, I think that quote was a culmination of a lot of things that have hit, so I'm excited to really dive into that one this week later.
Let's bring this conversation home with one, maybe two more.
Yeah.
I've got a couple in the queue here. Is there one in particular that you wanted to go to next?
Go for it.
Well, it's funny. So as you were talking, I was like, I would have loved to have asked her, like, will you be my art mom? Yeah. And it's one thing to ask for a mentor, but will you be my art mom? Yeah, just like, yeah, to have been in her presence and even just, absorb her energy would have
Yeah,
been
I don't know
something
how that would have
special.
worked because I think you would have ended up moving things around all the time for her instead of because I
Yeah.
know watching Jerry, her assistant in the
Yeah.
film, I'm sure that was a pretty symbiotic relationship that very few would be able to have
Right.
because her drive was so heavy that I can only imagine 10, 12 hours a day, Jerry's moving marble and steel and rocks around. And I don't know how much mentoring or
Right.
mothering there would be space for.
That's fair. That's
But
fair.
we can dream about it. You can
That's
dream
fair.
about
Yeah.
it,
Yeah.
Nathan.
Yeah.
You can
Yeah.
dream about it.
So yeah. So I'll read this one. She said, "My mother was a restorer. She repaired broken things. I don't do that. I destroy things. I cannot go the straight line. I must destroy, rebuild, destroy again. My rhythm is not the same. My mother moved in a straight line. I go from one extreme to another." I'll take first crack at this one because this, of the ones we've discussed today, this is the one I probably spent the most time thinking about.
Yeah.
Because it's taken me a while to, and I don't fully understand it. I don't know if I ever will, and I'm okay with that. But why it is that I feel so compelled to destroy things, to pull out the essence of what I find important to reflect back and share. It's a brutal process what I put material through. I try not to personify, these inanimate, objects and material, but sometimes I do, and I think it's because of the past experience and the sort of implied meaning that gets imbued in the material,
Mm-hmm.
as I'm working with it. But I almost don't know how to work with the surface or how to work with the material until it's been degraded, or damaged.
Yeah.
I'm so just infatuated and attracted to that sort of wabi sabi, idea
Mm-hmm.
of the beauty that is found as things degrade and rot and fall apart, over time, that whether it's already happened in that material before it got to me, or whether
Yeah.
it's, what I put it through, that destructive process, to then again break it down to just, I've
Yeah.
got this insatiable curiosity. Like, I just want to burn it, melt it, carve it, rip it. Like, what's inside there? And that again is again, I've come to understand, didn't go into it this way, but came to
Mm-hmm.
realize that that's,
Yeah.
a big part of what I'm trying, the mystery that I'm trying to unravel, as well as like,
Yep.
what's in here? How did it get there? And what do I do with it going forward?
Yeah.
All right, I've uncovered something, a material, uh, a feeling. What do I do with it? How do
Yeah.
I let's just keep it in the art material space for the moment. How do I take this thing that is very different than what it was when it was pristine and
Yeah.
perfect and had factory edges, on the
Yeah.
shelf, and looked almost exactly like all of its neighbors. Now that it doesn't, now that it is this thing that is unique to itself and is more interesting because of the damage, it's more useful, it's more, to me, important because of the scars, because of those, things that, again, the hell that it didn't want to go through, but is way better because of that process. That for me is the riddle that I love attempting to unravel, with full knowledge that I may never get to the end. In fact, I'm a little afraid of what would happen if I did.
Well, I mean, that's kintsugi.
Mm-hmm.
That
Yeah,
is
that's right.
the Japanese art of kintsugi, and
Yeah.
treating something that is broken and repairing the history of the object rather than something to disguise it, right? Because so many times when something breaks, people try to glue it together to where you don't see the cracks.
Yeah.
Right. And in
Mm-hmm.
kintsugi, it's highlighted by gold or silver in the process or platinum to bring those pieces back together, but still revealing those broken pieces and the cracks as something more beautiful than the original object.
I'm not sure if I've ever
Right.
shared this with you. My most, it's like one of three things that I would grab from the house if it was on fire, apart from the human beings and, of course, Leo, I'd take you too, buddy. He's like, whatever, dude. Apart from the living things in my home, it's one of the three objects that I would run back into the house on fire to grab, and it's this dish. It's the china that my mom had growing up. So that in of itself has meaning to me because, for the important meals, we'd pull out this particular set of china, and it's a plate that broke while my daughters were at grandma's house, and I don't remember the timing of it, but I had shared this concept of kintsugi with Ella, with our youngest, and she just had this idea. She's like, I want to make that with this broken plate. I want to make that for Dad for his birthday, and so she got this adhesive. And then she painted the seams all gold. It's the
Love
most.
it.
It is. It's like, because it touches on my mom, my daughter. It means so much. And again, to your point, and great. That's a great example. I'm glad you brought that up. But so much more interesting and so much more important because it was broken and of how it was repaired.
Yeah, I want to add something real quick to that quote because she talks about being the destroyer of things. And obviously in that quote, there's insane respect for her mother that she loved dearly, that got sick with the Spanish flu when she was young and died young. And thinking about, I want to talk about the spiders, her spider sculptures.
Yeah.
Because she says, I repair broken things. And there's times she talks about making things that are ugly and things like that. But to her, they're beautiful. And the spider, right? Most people hate spiders. Hate them, right? People want to kill the spider. People want to get rid of it, have animal, spiders are bad, but she felt completely opposite. And the reason she makes the spiders is because they're her mom.
Yeah.
The spiders represent her mom. They're love letters to her mom, who was clever and friendly. She says spiders are clever. They're friendly. Why are they friendly? Because they eat mosquitoes, and mosquitoes bring disease. So she also sees spider as protector.
Yeah.
So you think of walking under the spider, right? In the sculpture, that's a form of protection. As you walk under any of her spider sculptures, it's a form of protection as well. And I don't know, I just thought that was so cool because I'd never known that about the spiders and that reference. And here, she respects her mom and loves her so much. And she goes from one extreme to the other, she says, when she creates, but we think of the spider as destructive, but she thinks as this creature as the ultimate protector, and akins it to her mom. I just love that.
Well done. I mean, that's a perfect example and probably a great way for us to put a bow on our conversation today. But I love it. I mean, again, like, I don't know. And I have experienced a couple of the spiders in person. I think I told the story on that previous episode of just happening upon one on a run and just being completely blown away, just getting lost in a city I wasn't familiar with. But to the quote, let's end where we started. A work of art doesn't have to be explained. I didn't need that explanation to appreciate and have a reaction and experience, a meaningful one, with the spider. I had a feeling about it. It touched me. Was it what she was going for? That's not even the right way of saying it. Was it what it represented to her? Not exactly. And that's okay.
Yeah.
That's okay. And in some ways, maybe almost better, right? The fact that it is open to interpretation. That's art, baby. It's subjective. You're gonna like what you like. You're gonna not like what you like. You're gonna read into it and experience what you're experiencing. And I guess I just assume that most people do this. I'm just gonna say this out loud regardless. I'm hoping that when, I know that you do, but when a person goes to experience art in person, I'm guessing that everybody who's listening takes in the work first before they read the card.
Yeah.
Before they, and I do both, generally, but I never read the card first because I don't want to be influenced by,
it's like
by
reading the last
meaning,
page of a book.
Exactly.
Sorry, that was a jab at my sister.
Okay.
Love you, Jill. But yeah.
It's a great way to build a podcast audience, is just make individual jabs.
Make fun of people.
One listener who may or may not actually be listening. Well, good stuff.
I have something I want to read to close us out, if you don't mind.
Please. Yeah.
This is something I wrote, I think, right after that series of art that I talk about in this. I wrote a blog post. And so I think this is a good way. It's short, 2 sentences, but I think it's really good. Not to toot my own horn at all. I think it's it's something that moved me that I wrote. Whether it moves you or not is to be seen. But it says, art is life, art is breath, art is story, art is observation. Art is saying the things that others cannot say. Art is voice, so live, breathe, and create.
Art is all of those things and anything else that you want it to be.
Yeah.
Right? It's
So
all
don't forget.
It's all of the above and.
Yeah.
You know, fill in the blank.
And don't forget, just make art, period.
That's it. I mean, and experience art, and that's really, I guess, I mean, that's really what we set out to do. I mean, there's plenty of great art podcasts that most of our listeners are probably, listening to, as well. We consume a bunch of other great art podcasts out there. What we were hoping to introduce to the conversation, and I hopefully today's episode was an example of that, is just, if you are in the game of expressing yourself in any creative way, i.e., if you're a human being who's still taking up, space and oxygen, and have a way of expressing yourself, there's value to not just taking in a lot of art in all its many forms, but to also trying to, kind of get in the heads and hearts a little bit of the people who have made work that influences you personally. Yeah. And there's never been a better time, in history to have all of this information, at your fingertips, most of which is for free or virtually free. So that would be if there's a tangible takeaway to kind of throw your way as we kind of close, it's like, just get curious about, what we can learn from the people that have come before us. And to the extent,
please.
And to the extent that you're currently capable, consider how being radically vulnerable, as it's appropriate and for you, for where you're at right now, but sharing your story can impact others, and also in the process can be reflected back to you in a healing and restorative way. It's incredibly powerful, and it can't be underestimated.
Absolutely. Find us on Instagram, Nathan Terborg on Instagram, and Ty Nathan Clark on Instagram. You can listen to us on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, anywhere you podcast, you'll find it. And for all the back episodes, they're all listed on there from season 1 and season 2. And please find us on YouTube. You can see our faces and you can see all the things we talk about, because we do put up video and images of the work, our shows, the artists we're talking about, their work, etc. And hope you have an incredible studio week. Get to work.
The end. Come on. Give that man his flowers.
Nothing.
Give that man his balloons.